So anyway, I'm very happy to have as our first speaker Sam Barron from the University of Melbourne. That's very happy to have you here. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks, Baptiste, and thank you very much for the invitation. All right, fully instrumental metaphysics. So this is a conference about beyond space-time and linking up to the metaphysics of quantum gravity. And for the most part, I won't be talking about that, but the talk is bookended by thoughts about the metaphysics of quantum gravity. So I don't know about you, but in conversation, I've received a fair bit of skepticism about doing anything metaphysical to do with quantum gravity, not just quantum gravity, but especially quantum gravity. And what I wanted to do was try and provide a bit of a defense of doing metaphysics of this kind. And in doing that, I sort of went down the rabbit hole of defending metaphysics a little bit in general and realizing that maybe the way that I think about metaphysics is quite different to the way that the people that were criticizing me were thinking about metaphysics. So I discovered, I think, that I'm an instrumentalist about metaphysics. For a moment, I was a little bit worried about that. I'd spent lots of my career not being in that mindset, but then I decided that that's okay because you should all be instrumentalists too. And that's what this paper is about. Okay, so my goal today is to argue in favor of what I call full instrumentalism about metaphysics. I'm going to explain to you what I mean by full instrumentalism and metaphysics to get started with. And then I'm going to offer you an argument in favor of instrumentalism of this kind. And then I'm going to defend that argument in two stages. I'm going to argue that metaphysics has no non-instrumental value. You'll know what that means in a minute. And then I'm going to argue that metaphysics has some instrumental value. Okay? So that will get us to this view that we should at least be instrumentalists about metaphysics. And also that quantum gravity is a good place to look for instrumental value for metaphysics. All right, so what is metaphysics? Good question, I don't really know. Here's the thing that lots of people say. They say that metaphysics is the search for general and fundamental truths about reality. You might wonder what the difference between metaphysics and science is. Not everyone thinks about metaphysics this way, but that's what I'm going to go with for today. It captures a lot of what people have in mind, and in particular a lot of what the skeptics of metaphysics have in mind. So this is often the target when people are arguing against metaphysics. Really, it doesn't matter. If you think metaphysics is ever in the business of getting truth, then the arguments that I present to you will work. It doesn't really matter what kinds of truths, but if you think that there's something like epistemically valuable to be gained from metaphysics and it has anything to do with truth, then what I say will work. It doesn't matter what the truths are. Okay, instrumental. So instrumentalism, in my sense, relates to the value of metaphysics, where we hold fixed its aim. So we assume that metaphysics aims at the truth, but then we've got sort of different ways of thinking about what happens when metaphysics aims at the truth. So you could think that it's valuable because it can and maybe does achieve its aims. So that would be a non-instrumental value for metaphysics. On the other hand, you could think it's instrumentally valuable where it's valuable not because it can or does achieve its aims, but for some other reason. So sort of along the way to trying to do metaphysics, you manage to achieve something valuable, but the actual aims of metaphysics are not things that you can achieve. So instrumental metaphysics is that. It's sort of getting something valuable from metaphysics along the way to trying to do something that you thought you were doing, but you can't actually do. The source of instrumental value could be basically anything. So you could think it's instrumentally valuable for art, poetry, well-being, origami, bus driving. I don't really care what you think the value lies in, but I'm mostly going to be talking about the value for science because that's what I care about. But actually I think that metaphysics could be instrumentally valuable for lots of things. Look, if it helps a bus driver come up the mountain better, so be it. Okay, finally, full. So full instrumentalism relates to this distinction that you find in lots of discussions of metaphysics, particularly on the skeptical side, between so-called naturalistic and non-naturalistic metaphysics. So naturalistic metaphysics, very roughly, is metaphysics that's connected to science, and non-naturalistic metaphysics is metaphysics that's not connected to science. And there's lots of work to be done to flesh out that distinction. If you want a better distinction, a better account of what naturalistic metaphysics is, good luck, I'm not going to provide that for you. We can have a good debate about that, but I'm pretty skeptical actually that there is a good way to maintain this distinction, but for now, this rough way of doing it will be fine. So full instrumentalism is instrumentalism about both types. There are lots of instrumentalists about non-naturalistic metaphysics already, right? So people like Jerry Banofsky, French Mackenzie, Alyssa Ney, maybe Ladyman and Ross, maybe Heather Dyke and James McLaurin, all of these people are sort of on board with the idea that non-naturalistic metaphysics might be instrumentally valuable, and that's it, that you can't actually get any non-instrumental value out of non-naturalistic metaphysics. Not many people are instrumentalist about naturalistic metaphysics. So these folks who are instrumental about non-naturalistic metaphysics, they're instrumental in the following sense: non-naturalistic metaphysics is useful for naturalistic metaphysics. So they sort of rely on the idea that naturalistic metaphysics is non-instrumentally valuable and then draw the instrumental value for non-naturalistic metaphysics that way. What I think we should do, though, is push the instrumentalism all the way through into naturalistic metaphysics as well. I just don't think there is a version of metaphysics, at least that along these lines, that you can be non-instrumentalist about. Okay, so that's the view that I'm going to argue for. And this is the way in which this goes further than I think some previous instrumentalism about metaphysics has gone before, because most people are going to be non-instrumental about the naturalistic side of things. Okay, so to make the case for full instrumentalism about metaphysics, I'm going to do two things. First thing is I'm going to take what I take to be the main argument for the view that non-naturalistic metaphysics lacks instrumental value and generalize it to naturalistic metaphysics. So I'm going to show that that argument just pushes all the way through even to metaphysics connected to science. And then I'm going to try and argue that, so that gets you the idea that naturalistic metaphysics doesn't have instrumental value, doesn't have non-instrumental value, and then I'm going to argue that it has instrumental value nonetheless. The argument that I'm going to focus on is an argument aimed at the methods. And you find this in Ladyman and Ross, McLaurin and Dyke, French and Mackenzie to some extent. Lots of people are very skeptical about the idea that the methods of metaphysics are sufficient for achieving its aims. And they put that onto the non-naturalistic side, but I think that the same argument just runs through into naturalistic metaphysics. So here's the argument, roughly. Non-naturalistic metaphysics has non-instrumental value if it can achieve its aims. Right, so that's sort of the condition under which you can get non-instrumental value out of non-naturalistic metaphysics. And it can achieve its aims only if its methodology is sufficient for doing so. Lots of people think that its methodology is not sufficient for doing so, and so it has no non-instrumental value. So what I want to do is just pull out the non-naturalistic there and just say that this argument works for metaphysics to core. Okay, some notes on this argument. The methods at stake are ones by which non-naturalistic metaphysics can arrive at the truth. So these are methods by which we select between competing claims. So there are lots of methods in metaphysics that aren't necessarily of that type. We're looking at the methods by which you select between competing claims. And there are three broad methods that you'll find non-naturalistic metaphysicians using, but also you'll find people criticizing non-naturalistic metaphysics for using. So one of these is intuition / fit with common sense. Oh, how many objects are in the room? Depending on your Mariology, 3, 12, whatever. Intuitively, 17. That must be the truth. Inference, the best explanation. What is the best explanation for, pick your favorite metaphysical fact. I don't know how many objects are in the room again. Or optimization of theoretical virtue. So you look at your different metaphysical theories and you pick the theory that has like the most simplicity, most elegance, fecundity, whatever it is that you take to be the good-making features of a theory in metaphysics. Then you pick the theory that does best on the theoretical virtues, and that's how you get to the truth. I'm going to set aside methods that aren't used to pick between competing claims. The problems with these three methods are pretty well known. So I'm not going to go through them in a great deal of detail, but I will tell you a little bit about why people think these three methods fail to be conducive to the truth, particularly in the case of non-naturalistic metaphysics. Okay, so first of all, intuition / fit with common sense. I probably don't need to convince anyone here that using your intuitions to establish the truth of basically anything is a bad idea, but just so you know, there's a lot of work showing that intuitions of the kind that philosophers have previously relied on are highly parochial, maybe like down to the person, but at least down to like philosophical traditions or cultures or whatever. That intuitions are just not things that are sort of stable across everyone. And that's a reason to think that there's something sort of epistemically dubious about using intuitions to establish the truth. Similarly with common sense, it turns out that common sense is not all that common. Our common sense varies massively, and it depends on who you are and where you come from, and those sorts of things are, again, reasons to think that there's something wrong with the use of intuitions. There's a sort of, the rise of experimental philosophy was also the rise of bashing intuitions for a long time, and you'll see a lot of criticisms coming from there. as I said, I don't think I need to convince anyone about this. Okay, the next one is inference the best explanation. So here you could argue that a metaphysical claim is true because it's the best explanation of some fact. The way that IBE works is that you gather a set of hypotheses and then you rank them to choose the best. And again, you're ranking them in terms of their virtues. So they might be more simple, more elegant, have greater power, whatever it is. You rank them and then the one that dominates is the one that you pick. So IBE in general faces really bad problems. And here are two of them. The first of these is a problem that comes up, I think, for the first time in Van Fraasen's sort of attack on scientific realism, which is the best of a bad lot objection. So he says, look, how do you know that when you did that selection of hypotheses at the beginning, that you picked a set that contains the truth? All you may have done is rank the best of a bad, like rank your bad hypotheses and pick the best of that bad lot. And so that means that you can never really be confident that the thing that comes out of the IBE deliberation is the truth, because it may be that you didn't even start with a space of hypotheses that contained the truth. That's the best of a bad lot objection. The second objection, which I actually think is worse than the best of a bad lot objection, is just the lack of any algorithm for actually doing IBE. So there's a number of books written on how it is that we might measure the virtues of explanations, how it is that we might rank the virtues of explanation, how it is that we might come up with an optimization algorithm across those virtues, and the long and short of it is that there is just no consensus on how to do this. And I think, I'm pretty skeptical that there ever will be, to be honest. I think that this is like a really serious problem. And this is not just a problem in philosophy. I think this is a problem with IBE in science. Most of the criticism of IBE is actually on the science side. People are saying, use of IBE in science is kind of broken, we should be using a Bayesian epistemology instead because that's more reliable, it's more evidential, yada, yada, yada. Right, so this is not just problems for IBE in philosophy. Okay, lots of attempts to solve these. Peter Lipton has an interesting book where he tries. None has been devised yet. I think the sort of, the consensus view these days is that IBE is a kind of heuristic, a useful heuristic for maybe getting at the things that a Bayesian epistemology does better, and that it's sort of useful for that reason, but not exactly truth tracking. Okay, next, theoretical virtues. The method of theoretical virtues involves weighing all of the different characteristics of your theories and picking the theory that is the best in terms of those characteristics. And as I said, there's things like simplicity, fecundity, elegance. Again, explanatory power is in there. So you're also going to inherit some of the worries with explanatory power when you're doing theoretical virtues. And there are roughly three problems here. The first one is there is no master list of virtues. We just don't know what the virtues of theories are, at least when it comes to getting to the truth. Right? There's lots of candidate virtues, but we just don't know. There's no clear way to measure the virtues, so we don't exactly know how to put a metric or what the shape of the simplicity function might be, such that if you've got this amount of simplicity, it's a good thing. And we don't have, again, an algorithm for balancing the virtues. There's just nothing like this that's ever been produced that looks halfway plausible. And it's sort of unclear how you would settle debates about what that algorithm would be without sort of having access to the truth. So there's a sort of there are bootstrapping worries lurking in the background here too. Okay, so what about science? Aren't all of these, some people do think all of these, but at least IB and theoretical virtues are used in science. And as I said, they probably are. I'm inclined to think they're broken if they're used in science as well. I also think that philosophers overestimate the extent to which scientists rely on these methods for solving things in science. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about exactly what we think the methodology of science is. But look, I think, if it's broken in science, that doesn't diminish what I'm saying. It's broken everywhere. But there is something you can do here, and this comes up in the literature on IBE and the literature on theoretical virtues. You could say, look, scientists are pretty good at using IBE, they're pretty good at using theoretical virtues, assuming they are, assuming that it is used in science and it does get to the truth. And maybe what you can do is sort of run a justification for the use of IBE based on its success in science. So you sort of do an induction over the historical track record of science and say, look, scientists have managed to find, select a group of hypotheses that gets you close to the truth at each stage. And so they're sort of good at evading the best of a bad lot objection. We don't really know how, but it doesn't matter. They've got it worked out, so we can just borrow what they're doing. Similarly, with the theoretical virtues, you might think that scientists are pretty good at coming up with a way of optimizing or ranking the virtues. and getting close to the truth in doing so, and so we can just rely on what they're doing and transport it over to philosophy. The issue, though, is that metaphysics is not science. I think if it is science, then like, what are we talking about anymore? So if metaphysics is not science, it's not clear that you can just carry the inductive support that you have in science straightforwardly over to metaphysics, because there's a discontinuity in the two disciplines, and so at least to some extent, maybe they're like overlapping some ways, but they're not completely the same discipline, and so there's a worry about how much you can carry inductive support for one methodology over into another discipline. I'll come back to that a bit more later on. Okay, so now I just want to generalize this argument. So the argument is taking aim at these three methods in non-naturalistic metaphysics. The reasons I've given you for doubting those methods don't have a lot to do with metaphysics, and that's already a sort of like indication that this argument is generalizable. If the problems with these methods are sort of like general problems, even in science, we should worry then about if this is how metaphysics proceeds, that it's ever sort of like methodologically capable. But if we want to generalize this argument, we need to defend three claims. The first one is that in achieving the aims of naturalistic metaphysics, we're forced to use these methods in the following sense. We're forced to choose between competing claims or theories. Right? If we're not even forced to make those choices, then we don't need methods for selecting between them. So I'm going to need to argue for that. The second claim I need to argue for is that the methods available for choosing between these claims in naturalistic metaphysics are just the methods that we have available in non-naturalistic metaphysics. Okay? And then the third thing that I need to argue for is that the flaws that you find in the methods of non-naturalistic metaphysics are not really solved by going into naturalistic metaphysics. The connection to science doesn't make these methods suddenly work in a way that when they're disconnected from science, they don't work. Right? That's the thing that I need to argue for. So I'm going to focus on these three claims for a little bit. Okay, so in order to establish this first claim that if you're doing naturalistic metaphysics, you probably need to end up making these choices, has a lot to do with this idea that scientific theories underdetermine metaphysics. So if you've got a theory like general relativity, one of the things we sort of know about this is that there's lots of competing ontologies or metaphysics that we can at least argue about whether they're correct for that theory. Because it seems like general relativity itself as a theory just doesn't fully settle metaphysical questions. If it did, I think naturalistic metaphysics would be kind of easy. You would just like take general relativity, you'd look into the theory and be like, oh, okay, well this is what it says about the world, and off we go. We don't have to do any kind of theory choice. It's not clear to me we have to do any metaphysics at that point. But we do know that general relativity seems, at least on the face of it, to be compatible with lots of distinct ontologies. There's lots of ways this could go. So just with thinking about what space-time is, you can disagree about whether it's the metric field or the metric and the matter field or the metric and the manifold or something like that. You've also got functionalist accounts of what space-time is in general relativity. You've got structuralist accounts. You've also got cross-cutting debates between like relationalists and substantivalists about the ontology of general relativity. You've also got debates about A theories and B theories of time that arise in general relativity. So lots of metaphysical debates can be had, and that's because general relativity just seems to be underdetermining what the metaphysics is. And because of that underdetermination, we have to try and select for the truth, and that's going to require a method, and the methods, as I'll argue in a minute, that we have available are the ones from non-naturalistic metaphysics. Okay, so the second claim, which is this claim about the available methods, so here what I need to show is that the available methods for theory choice in naturalistic metaphysics are just those in non-naturalistic metaphysics. So the first thing to notice here is that the same methods are available, right? So it's not like you can't use IBE in the case of naturalistic metaphysics, or you can't use theoretical virtues, and you can't use intuition if you really want. Off you go. So those methods are available. The question is whether there are any novel methods that arise via the connection to science. So far as I know, there's only two options for this that have been suggested in the literature, and so I'm going to focus on those, but if people have ideas about ways in which connecting to science gives you new methodologies for doing metaphysics, I'd be super interested, not just for this, but because I'd like to try them out. So the first one is from Ladyman and Ross. They suggest this thing called the principle of naturalistic closure, which I'll tell you about in a second. And the other one, due to Elisane, is the running of indispensability arguments. What I want to show is that neither of these sort of so-called new methods, and I do think they are new because they rely on the connection to science, neither of these new methods actually get us away from the problems that inhabit the methods that we already have in non-naturalistic metaphysics. Okay. Here's the principle of naturalistic closure from Ladyman and Ross. I'm going to be pretty brief about this because what the principle says is that any new metaphysical claim that is to be taken seriously at time t should be motivated by and only by the service it would perform, if true in showing how two or more specific scientific hypotheses, at least one of which is drawn from fundamental physics, jointly explain more than the sum of what is explained by the two hypotheses taken separately. This is not a method for choosing between claims. This is a method for choosing which claims to take seriously, but it's not a method for getting at the truth. Okay. So this is not a method of the right kind that would actually replace the kind of methods that we have that are sort of broken about non-naturalistic metaphysics. That's all I'm going to say about this. The second one is the use of indispensability arguments. So indispensability arguments is an argument style where what you do is you say, okay, look at the take a scientific theory and look at the features that are in that scientific theory. Which things should you believe exist? Well, the features that kind of can't be pulled out of that theory without damaging it, roughly. So a feature is indispensable to a scientific theory just when the theory contains that feature, and there's no alternative theory that lacks the feature that's just as good. Now that just as good should raise a bit of an alarm bell because we're back to theoretical virtues there, right? So I'll talk about that in a sec. But the idea is that we should believe in the existence of the features by virtue of the indispensable role that they play in our scientific theories. The indispensability argument has been used for the most part in the philosophy of mathematics to establish the existence of numbers and mathematical objects, the idea being that mathematical objects are indispensable to your best scientific theories, so we should believe in those. But Alyssa Ney suggests that we should generalize this as a strategy for doing naturalistic metaphysics. So all naturalistic metaphysics, she thinks, is just like running indispensability arguments on science. As I said, this method uses the theoretical virtues. We have to compare two theories in terms of their quality. But these are scientific theories that we're comparing. And if it is the case that we can sort of rely on science having, for the most part, gotten a good sense of how the theoretical virtues work and applying them successfully, maybe we can just lean on the scientific methodology to scaffold the methodology of naturalistic metaphysics. We don't have to run an independent defense for the theoretical virtues if we can rely on that kind of induction over the history of science that I was talking about before. That's the idea anyway. But I think there's a problem here, and the problem is that for the indispensability approach to work, we have to be talking about distinct scientific theories. So we have to talk about, like, I don't know, thinking about maybe general relativity and Newton-Cartan gravity. If you think that these are distinct theories, those are the kinds of theories that we would be comparing. But when we're doing metaphysics of science, it looks like we're often just talking about a single theory. We're taking general relativity and we're trying to work out what the ontology of that theory is. We're not necessarily comparing general relativity to some other theory in order to work out whether some feature is indispensable or not. What that means is that because we're not selecting between scientific theories, the indispensability machinery just doesn't apply. So it's not going to be a way for doing the kind of thing that we want to do in naturalistic metaphysics, which is, work out what the ontology of general relativity might be or the ontology of quantum mechanics might be, because we're sort of sitting within a single theory, at least a single scientific theory, and then doing metaphysics, not comparing between scientific theories. Okay, so I just don't think this helps us do naturalistic metaphysics. The last claim that I have to defend is this idea that when you connect up to science, your methods don't suddenly get better. So if you've got method of inference to best explanation, theoretical virtues, these aren't just revived by virtue of you sort of doing metaphysics in relation to science in some way. So we can just think about each of the methods in turn and see whether they get better when we start doing them in relation to science. I think intuition we can set aside fairly quickly. I don't see why my intuitions about the metaphysical nature of the world suddenly get better when I start doing a bit of science at the same time. Right? It's not clear how that would work. And at any rate, I feel like we'd need some kind of test in order to determine that. We'd have to sort of take my intuitions before, my intuitions after, and show that they're closer to the truth, but then we're going to need some independent access to the truth to actually work out how that works. So I just don't think intuition, and it's also the case that the problems with intuitions just aren't solved by science. They're still culturally inflected, they're still parochial. Science doesn't take that away from us. So I just don't see that there's a solution there. With respect to IBE and the theoretical virtues, as I've said, those problems are present in science. So it would be surprising if the connection to science suddenly solved those problems, right? The best you can do is have this induction over cases, over the history of science, and then show that because we can run that induction, we can justify the use of these methods in science and then sort of try and carry that over into naturalistic metaphysics. But the induction at best justifies the use of these methods in scientific cases. And what I'm trying to press on you is that the sorts of things we might be doing in naturalistic metaphysics, where we're trying to work out the ontology between distinct theories, it's not clear that those choices that we're making are of the same type that scientists are looking at when they're choosing between their theories. They're not generally thinking about whether ontic structural realism of the radical or the moderate kind is true when they're trying to work out what's going on with general relativity. And so insofar as they've got methods for doing IBE or working with theoretical virtues in science, they're not they're not sort of so easily transferable. Well, the inductive support is not so easily transferable to what we're trying to do in metaphysics because we're trying to do something different. And that's how inductions usually fail, right? If you're moving from one domain of cases to another, you'd better have some argument that the induction works, and it's not clear what that would be. Okay, that's the argument. That's why I think that if you're thinking about the methods of non-naturalistic metaphysics and you think non-naturalistic metaphysics fails because those methods are kind of broken, it doesn't get better when you start doing naturalistic metaphysics because it just doesn't look like we have new methods. It looks like we've got to do the same kind of thing, and it doesn't look like the connection to science actually revives those methods. So I think that gets you the sort of negative claim that I want, which is that metaphysics in general has no non-instrumental value, right? Because the aims of metaphysics, namely trying to find the truth, are just completely, the methods are just completely inadequate for actually achieving those aims. But what I do want to say is that metaphysics nonetheless has instrumental value. And by that I mean like we can continue aiming at the truth, we can continue trying to do that. We'll never get there, sorry, but maybe we'll do some cool stuff along the way. And that's the kind of instrumentalism that I like. Half of the work in defending instrumentalism about metaphysics has already been done for me. The people that are instrumentalist about non-naturalistic metaphysics, they argue that the value of non-naturalistic metaphysics inheres in naturalistic metaphysics. So we've already got a kind of connection, the first step of the chain from one kind of metaphysics to another, which gets us the instrumental value of non-naturalistic metaphysics. So I'm going to set that aside and just focus on the case of naturalistic metaphysics, because if we can find value there, then it will just flow on into non-naturalistic metaphysics via that chain. So here's the basic idea, unsurprising, I think, given what I've already said. Naturalistic metaphysics is instrumentally valuable for science. And I thought this would be an easy thing to defend. It turns out to not be straightforward at all, I think, to spell out what is valuable about metaphysics for science, or valuable about naturalistic metaphysics for science. And by that I mean achieving the aims of science. But I think that there are three potential contributions, and I'm going to talk about these, and that'll be it. The first one of these draws on actually a bit of the defense of non-naturalistic metaphysics and its instrumental value for naturalistic metaphysics. So Stephen French and Kerry Mackenzie had this idea of sort of like Viking metaphysics. So if you're a naturalistic metaphysician, what you should do is look at what the sort of castles in the air that the non-naturalistic metaphysician has built and raid them for ideas in order to do your naturalistic metaphysics. Right? Or, less aggressive metaphor, you look at non-naturalistic metaphysics as a toolbox for doing naturalistic metaphysics. So I think we can just carry this idea over to science. We can think of Viking science. So the scientist can look at what we're doing in naturalistic metaphysics and rate it for ideas in order to progress science. Okay? The second one I'm going to talk about is how possibly explanations. So it's a particular kind of explanation that I think you can give in naturalistic metaphysics that's useful for science. And then the third one is about uncovering metaphysical assumptions that the scientists might have in their in the back of their mind when they're developing theories. Okay, so as I said, the Viking science idea relates to this Viking metaphysics idea, and what you're doing as a scientist, you can draw on aspects of naturalistic metaphysics to make progress. And I thought it'd be really nice if there are examples of this in the history of sort of science and philosophy already? I kind of think there are, but I need to do more work on this. There's this really interesting paper from John Norton where he looks at the sort of historical relationship between Einstein and Hume and argues that the sort of notion of relativity that Einstein uses is coming from a mixture of like Mach's sort of relationalism, but also Hume's notion that everything is sort of a relation between ideas. And it's those two ideas that Einstein sort of draws upon in order to develop relativity. And he thinks that there's historical evidence for this, that Einstein was clearly reading both Hume and Mach and drawing on their ideas, at least in conversation, maybe not in print. And so the thought here is that this might be an example of this kind of Viking science idea, right? Einstein is looking at what's going on in metaphysics. If we think of Hume's theory of ideas as a kind of empiricist metaphysics, which is how Hume thought of it. You could think of that as a kind of naturalistic metaphysics. And Einstein's raiding that for ideas in order to progress science, right? And of course, Hume is not trying to give Einstein ideas, and he's not trying to sort of do something that's instrumentally valuable. He thinks he's getting at the truth, but he sort of fails, and Einstein pulls something valuable nonetheless. So there you go, naturalistic metaphysics being instrumentally valuable. The second case, so the next two cases are going to be more related to the theme of this conference. These are cases, as I said, about how possibly explanations. So sometimes what you can do when you're trying to argue about what the correct metaphysics for a scientific theory is you end up building metaphysical models of those theories. So you've got your general relativity, and you show how relationalist ontology works. You show how a substantivalist ontology works. You sort of build these metaphysical pictures of the world that cohere with the theory in some way. And I think that activity, which you do along the road to the sort of theoretical choice thing that you do in trying to come to the truth of metaphysics, I think that activity itself is a valuable thing and potentially valuable for science. So one example of this that I have, which comes from sort of the metaphysics, quantum gravity stuff that people in the room have been doing, involves space-time emergence. So, at least according to Chris and Nick and some other folks, it looks like some theories in quantum gravity seem to eliminate space-time in some sense. And this gives rise to a kind of threat of empirical coherence. If your theory says that there's no such thing as space-time, how is it that you then do anything like empirical confirmation in favor of that theory? Because empirical confirmation seems like a thing that requires space and time. If your theory says that the very conditions under which confirmation can't occur, it looks like the theory is sort of empirically unverifiable in this really nasty way. And this looks like a problem, right? And it looks like it could be, you could think of this as a kind of conceptual problem that could, destroy programs in physics. If physicists start to think, oh God, these theories are not just unconfirmable in practice, but unconfirmable in principle, they might just, abandon research programs. I mean, maybe they might be a bit more dogmatic than that and continue anyway, but you can kind of see the threat. And so providing a model of what we can do to address this is show that space-time can sort of emerge from these theories in a way that, mathematically you can show it, but then also metaphysically you can see how the ontology of the theory could give rise to, something that is spatiotemporal, and that is then going to be a way of addressing these problems of empirical coherence because, the theory gives you, in fact, enough metaphysics to scaffold sort of experimental physics that you might want to be doing. And so, providing the model of the theory that shows you how that's possible, even if the model you provide is false, right? So a bunch of models have been provided. I provided some models, Baptiste and Chris and Nick, we've all provided some models, and Jess. Even if that's false, even if we're just completely off track, showing how it's possible nonetheless does something to sort of address this apparent conceptual incoherence in the construction of the theories. It shows that the theories aren't really conceptually incoherent after all. Okay, the last one, uncovering metaphysical assumptions. I think that providing multiple models of a scientific theory, multiple metaphysical models, is a really good way of showing that metaphysical assumptions are kind of not baked into the theories. So here the idea is that the underdetermination of metaphysics by physics or by science in general is a really helpful thing to demonstrate precisely because it shows that metaphysical assumptions that maybe scientists are carrying into the development of these theories are not actually justified as part of the theory. So here's an example. Causal set theorists like Faye Dowker and Sumati Thryer and these folks, they view their development of causal set theory, their theory of quantum gravity, in terms of the metaphysics of passage, right? So they say, finally, we found passage in the physics, we found the flow of time, and they sort of focus on something that looks like a growing block theory. And what's sort of helpful here is that philosophers have, and not so much the physicists themselves, but philosophers have shown, look, there's another way of thinking about causal set theory. You don't have to think of it in terms of passage. You can give a kind of block interpretation. And the physics kind of underdetermines which of these is true. And maybe also there are deep problems with the growing block interpretation as well. But at the very least, the physics is sort of underdetermining these two, which shows that the kind of metaphysical assumption that the physicists are carrying in the development of the theory is not itself warranted, that there's no reason to sort of think when you're developing the theory that it is a kind of passage-focused theory. And you can sort of see how if what you wanted was passage and you thought that this is how the theory had to work, that might alter how you develop the theory. And knowing that there's a different way of running the theory, a different kind of metaphysical interpretation, might make a difference to the kind of way you develop the theory and thus progress in that area. Okay, so summary, we should be full instrumentalists about metaphysics. And the reason we should be full instrumentalists about metaphysics is because the methodology of metaphysics is broken and in a way that does not get fixed by science. But I also think that being an instrumentalist is not so bad. We can just keep doing what we're doing, insofar as any of you in the room do the sort of like, try to work out what the metaphysical truth about a scientific theory is. You can just keep doing that. You don't really even have to worry so much that what you're doing is pointless, insofar as you'll never achieve your aims. You can still be doing something valuable because what you'll be doing might be rated by scientists who want some ideas for how to develop science. You might uncover metaphysical assumptions by virtue of showing the metaphysical underdetermination of theories, and you might show how a scientific theory could possibly be true, even if you don't show that it is actually true. And so, you know, business as usual for us as naturalistic metaphysicians, and so I think that it's okay to be an instrumentalist. And I should say none of this precludes other sources of instrumental value for metaphysics. So if you think that your Mereology makes your origami better, then go for it. Okay, thank you.
Right, now I have a comment from Annika.
So on the picture Sam just presented to us, we have this kind of chain from non-naturalistic metaphysics, which has instrumental value for naturalistic metaphysics, which has instrumental value for science. And what I would like to do in this short comment is to consider a possible continuation of this chain, so pushing the instrumentalism even further through, and so considering instrumentalism about science. And what I would like to suggest is that the instrumentalist about naturalistic metaphysics seems to be pulled in different directions about what stance to take about instrumentalism about science. So I'd like to suggest that there seems to be a very strong reason for the instrumentalist about naturalistic metaphysics to remain agnostic about instrumentalism about science, but also there seems to be some strong reason to reject it, and some, maybe not all that strong reason to accept it, but yeah, so I feel that there is a pull in different directions, which I find puzzling. So first, why to remain agnostic? So I don't think Sam said this explicitly in his talk, but in the paper version, he writes it that realism about science, and so also instrumentalism about science, these are exactly the kinds of metaphysical claims that are targeted by his argument. So the kind of claims that we do not have the right methods to arrive at their truth or falsity. So that would be one reason for the instrumentalist about science, maybe about metaphysics, sorry, maybe in doing metaphysics still to provide arguments and so on, business as usual, but as instrumentalists about metaphysics should in the end say, well, actually we cannot really arrive at truth or falsity of this claim. So that's the first direction. The second, why to reject it. So Sam presented three ways in which naturalistic metaphysics has instrumental value for science. So these were being a toolbox or a seed bank, providing how possible explanations, and uncovering metaphysical presuppositions or assumptions. And it seems to me that if we're instrumentalists about science, the second and third contribution lose their value in a way. So if we really think that scientific theories are not, strictly speaking, true, then it seems to me that there's not so much value anymore in uncovering metaphysical assumptions of these scientific theories or providing how possibly explanations. So if that is true, then there would only remain the seed bank or toolbox motivation. And this motivation, I think, non-naturalistic metaphysics is maybe even in a better place to provide, right? Because if it's really about being creative and having ideas for possible models that maybe the scientists wouldn't come up with themselves, then maybe it's even better if you're a bit more remote from the science. So it seems to me that at least if the instrumental value of naturalistic metaphysics is supposed to come from these three sources, then under the assumption of instrumentalism about science, this instrumental value of naturalistic metaphysics seems to fade away. And now the third reason why one maybe should even be drawn in the direction of instrumentalism about science, given the argument for instrumentalism about metaphysics, is that the reasons why people have argued for instrumentalism about science seem to be quite similar to the reasons Sam presented for instrumentalism about metaphysics. So skepticism about inference to the best explanation, underdetermination of theory by data, which is quite similar to underdetermination of metaphysics by physics. Now, Sam hinted at some possible ways of defending the inference to the best explanation in the case of science, well, maybe that succeeds, maybe it doesn't. In any case, I feel a certain tension between, so if instrumentalism about metaphysics is supposed to be true, then the arguments we have in that case should be somehow different from the arguments we have for the case of science, if this is supposed to be the kind of claim that we should remain agnostic about. So yeah, I guess that was my comment.
Okay, do you want to reply to
I mean, I'll just say a couple of things. Just on the second point first, I'm probably these days getting a bit instrumental about science as well, so I'm sort of happy with that. But I think there is something else that's interesting here, which is there's another argument that looks like it will get you the same place from instrumentalism about science. I think if you're an instrumentalist about science, it's really weird to be a non-instrumentalist about naturalistic metaphysics, right? So I think that there's some push in the other direction as well, maybe. And on the first point, I guess you're right that maybe it does weaken the second and third assumptions, but I think that scientists can have metaphysical assumptions even if there is no metaphysical truth that we can get at, and uncovering those assumptions can still be helpful because they can stand in the way of developing science, or like having different ways of like heuristics for thinking about science can be helpful. So I think that you can still have a little bit of value there. And for the second one about how possibly, again, it doesn't matter if we can't get to the truth. Showing how something could be true is different to showing that like it is true. And I think like we could still show how things could be true, which can still at least sort of get us around maybe sort of worries about conceptual incoherence at least. So I think there could still be some value, but I take the point that maybe if you're an instrumentalist about science, maybe you just care less about metaphysics and generally just like shut up and calculate. Yeah. Thanks, Annika.
Right, so we're going to take some questions. Okay, so Lorenzo first, keep your hands up. I'm going to
Come back up here in case I need to slide.
I would like to defend a bit Ney's indispensability approach. Well, in 2 minutes I'll not be able to be very detailed, but I want to give a few elements. So in general, I think that naturalistic metaphysicians would do well to incorporate some elements of the methodology of the big bad wolf, W.B. Quine. Your objection to the indispensability approach is that it ultimately relies on theoretical virtues, because something is indispensable if there is no better theory that does away with it. Right? So this presupposes a certain definition of what indispensability means, which reminds me of the definition that Mark Collivan gives of indispensability. But I think there is a better one that doesn't rely at all on theoretical virtues. If you take a scientific theory like GR, or say quantum mechanics, it's natural to think that, at least in the philosopher's sense, it's not one theory, but a collection of possible theories. It can be made precise or regimented in many different ways to different levels of detail. So if you take quantum mechanics, you can have different solution of measurement problem, or you can be wave function realist or not, so you can go into different level of details.
Yep.
The idea we can regiment it more. So you can imagine like a collection of possible regimentations.
Yep.
Suppose the indispensability argument sounds like that. You have a premise to the inference of the only explanation that says, well, it must be, we have evidence that it must be one of those collections.
Mm-hmm.
All of those versions of GR postulate semi-Riemannian manifolds. Therefore, semi-Riemannian manifolds exist. Something like that strikes me as you could survive your objection.
Yeah, so thank you for finding bonus slide 2 about indispensability. So I think what you're suggesting is that, so what I said was, you've got different, when you run the indispensability argument, it's on scientific theories, right? And my objection, like on the one hand, yeah, theoretical virtues I think are broken. But the other thought is that when we're looking at sort of the ontology of GR, it's not clear to me that we're looking at different scientific theories. And if the connection to science is supposed to do the work, it really needs to be about the scientific theories that we're working with that then justifies indispensability. So what you could do is apply sort of indispensability to GR plus an ontology, or in your case, you take all the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, which are maybe different solutions to the measurement problem, however you want to think about them, and you think of these as the different theories that you're running your indispensability argument over, rather than, quantum mechanics, full stop, and just not saying anything further, right? So I guess my worry here is that those are, and this is going to annoy at least some people. It's not obvious to me that those are different scientific theories. I think that they're different sort of couples between a scientific theory and a metaphysics. And because of that, I think that we have to be very careful with this sort of inductive support for the theoretical virtues that can warrant the use of them in naturalistic metaphysics. Because what I worry about is that scientists, if insofar as they are, and I will say that I do think that the theoretical virtues are just broken in science as well, but insofar as we can warrant them via this induction over the case history of science, it's going to be across scientific theories. And it's not obvious to me it's going to be generalized to this sort of couple between a scientific theory and a metaphysical theory. And as I said, this is controversial, because some people are going to say, no, look, every idea of quantum mechanics is a different scientific theory. I just don't think so. I think it's a piece of metaphysics.
Maybe super briefly, I think that's the real disagreement. I think that what the real lesson that Quine taught us is that there is no sharp distinction between what is metaphysics and what is science. They are enmeshed, and it's not easy to separate. So I think that's the main assumption I think some people, and I in particular, would like to challenge.
Yeah, and I guess what we need to look at is like, what is the inductive support for the theoretical virtues? What kinds of theories are people actually choosing between? Are they choosing between sort of like metaphysical variants of scientific theories, or are they choosing between scientific theories sort of in general? My feeling is that insofar as the theoretical virtues have been successful in science, it's because there's one theoretical virtue that we know that works, and that's empirical adequacy. And we choose between our theories that way, and then the scientists just sort of say, I don't really care about the rest. So, unless they, maybe get into their 60s and then they start caring about like the ontology of quantum mechanics a little bit more. I don't know.
Joanna, and then Chris?
Okay, so you have argued that when metaphysics appeals to science, then it doesn't give it really new methods, but I was wondering whether that connection to science might be helpful for metaphysics in a different way, namely not giving new methods, but giving like new material for the same methods to work on. And for example, if you think that the main method is inference to the best explanation, then if I don't appeal to science, I have only some phenomena from the everyday experience to explain, but if I appeal to science, I get a lot of new phenomena to be explained, and then that in this way, this might improve the usage of IBE in metaphysics.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think my response is that the ways in which IBE are broken are not to do with the source material, not to do with the hypotheses that the nature of the hypotheses, right? So I agree that science gives you, data, like empirical data to work with to mount your IBE. But the problems with IBE are not that there's something wrong about the data. The problems with IBE are that we don't know how explanation works well enough to know what the virtues are. So even if you swap the data for another kind of data, you still have the problem of actually coming up with an algorithm that balances the virtues, and we just lack that algorithm. So that's the sense in which I think even then the connection to science doesn't give you what you need. But that's a nice thought, thanks.
Right. Chris?
Oh, okay. My point is similar. I suppose I can be very brief, therefore, as what Annika raised and also Lorenzo. If we assume a continuity, or at least not a strict discontinuity in methods and subject matter between science and sort of naturalistic philosophy of science, and if we want to maintain a form of scientific realism about the science, then I think it's going to be difficult to really maintain a full instrumentalism about naturalistic metaphysics or philosophy of science. So I'm worried, again, I suppose like Lorenzo, that your argument presupposes that there's some sort of deep and robust distinction between philosophy and science, which may not be there. And also, that there are different metaphysical variants of a scientific theory, so there's sort of a different way of integrating theories in science and then in metaphysical interpretations or metaphysical theories, and I'm not so sure this distinction can be cleanly made, and if it can't, then I suspect we have to be more realist on both sides or more instrumentalists on both sides.
Yeah. So I guess I don't think I'm presupposing a deep discontinuity. It's something odd about the sort of science is continuous with metaphysics idea, because you don't want it to be so continuous that the two disciplines collapse into each other, right? At least then we're just doing science, or or either all scientists are doing metaphysics or all metaphysicians are doing science, and there's sort of no, this sort of debate about the value of metaphysics starts to look a bit weird, I think. But maybe that is the take-home message from some of these things that I've been saying. But I think you can have a continuity between science and metaphysics and still sort of think that they're in the business of doing slightly different things, even if they're related to each other. And that's the sort of picture I had in my mind of naturalistic metaphysics. It's sort of doing a slightly different thing to what the scientist is doing. And insofar as it's doing a slightly different thing, even though there is a continuity, but maybe in method, maybe in subject matter, we've got to work out how to justify the methods getting towards the slightly different thing that we might be doing. If we really do collapse, then I think you're right. Either you're instrumentalist across the board, starting from science, running all the way into non-naturalistic metaphysics, or you're realist across the board, starting from science, all the way into non-naturalistic metaphysics. And if I had to choose, I'd probably be instrumentalist all the way through. The worry I have is that this question about whether we should be realist or instrumentalist, I think, is a naturalistic metaphysical question about science. And so my worry there is that the sort of concerns about method are just going to bite with that question. And so maybe the thing to do ultimately is sort of be agnostic, because I'm not sure we can even choose between those two options well enough. I certainly don't think we can assume realism and then carry that through into naturalistic metaphysics. I think we're going to have to justify realism. And how do we justify realism? The no miracles argument, inference the best explanation, and we're back to where we started. So there is definitely, I agree, I'm being a little bit simplistic about how this all works, but sort of on purpose to try and maybe bring out some of these sorts of questions a bit. Yeah.
Marta, and then Kim?
Thanks. Yeah, my question concerns the aim of metaphysics, because it seems like your argument is based on the idea that the aim of metaphysics is to actually get to the truth.
Yep.
And I'm a bit skeptic about that. I guess if you
sorry, keep going.
if you if you ask metaphysicians, even like naturalized metaphysicians, they will probably say something more close to the idea of how possibly explanation. Like, you know, the aim of metaphysics could be just, you know, to map out the conceptual space of the various metaphysical models of scientific theories and so on and so forth. So you don't actually need to get to the truth, just, you know, to show how possible truth and like these kind of models and these kind of possibilities.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, so thank you for finding bonus slide 5, change the aims. So you're right, like what we could do is like all of the sorts of things I've said about metaphysics, about it aiming at the truth, and it's like you aim at the truth and like you do something useful along the way, you might think that's a bit silly. Why don't we just aim at the useful thing in the first place and just do that, right? So I think you can, and so maybe we've got like just two breeds of, like two different kinds of things that we can do here. One of them is, you know, try and work out the truth and do some useful stuff along the way, and the other one is like try and do the useful stuff directly. And I don't really have a problem with those two things like existing alongside each other. I think that they're slightly different things. That you're going to do slightly different things in the two cases. You're going to, maybe if you're just aiming at the useful thing, maybe the thing to do is more like what the non-naturalistic metaphysician does and just like build models all day long, just like at random, hoping that something is useful for science. And if you're more on the like this sort of naturalistic metaphysics side, you sort of like try and do something that's getting at the truth, which is a more constrained activity. But maybe like both of them can just persist alongside each other. I guess there's this normative question about what the naturalistic metaphysician ought to be doing, and then there's a descriptive question about what they're in fact doing. I mean, it could be that in fact they're doing both of these things. It could be that, but that's fine, I think. Normatively, I don't know how you would argue that one should be doing one or the other, unless we could sort of come up with a more detailed story about which of these is more useful and how and all that kind of stuff. But I think that would be interesting to think about. One of the things that I've realized in doing this is that maybe we haven't thought enough about how metaphysics can be useful for science.
But like, if the aim is just to, you know, to do the useful things,
yeah,
then there is a sense in which it's not instrumentalist, just because like you know,
it's not instrumentalist in my sense, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like, you know, why should we? I don't know. It just might be that aiming, it's sort of like you want to achieve a thing, and it turns out that like really focusing on that thing doesn't work, and like thinking about something else is a better way of doing that thing. Sometimes, you know, giving talks is a bit like that. Don't think about giving a talk because you'll start to mess it up. Think about, you know, the mountains outside, and then you'll do a better job. It's a little bit like that. Yeah, thanks.
All right, Kian and then David.
Yeah, many thanks. Very interesting talk. So I want to come back basically to what Annika and Chris were pointing out. So I think I have many things now that I want to say, but maybe I boil this down to, yeah, maybe very roughly, how is this not just, okay, not maybe just, but how is this not a general not good enough argument that is then kind of turned into a no dirty hands argument in support of instrumentalism, too core, really for everything basically, as you say, and yeah, maybe just briefly like that.
I mean, it might be. I don't have, like I'm not like, oh, I have to be a realist about science and instrumentalist about metaphysics. I just don't have that view. And I don't see that you have to have that view. And in fact, because I think realism about science is a metaphysical view, I think we have to think about how this generalizes, like how this like flows back into science. But I don't think I think it's sort of weird because like it's not obvious to me that this will justify instrumentalism about science, because I think both realism and instrumentalism are metaphysical theses about science. And precisely my worry is that we're not going to be able to settle the truth between those two things. So it's not straightforwardly going to get you, I don't think, instrumentalism about science, but it sort of gets you an agnosticism about realism and instrumentalism, and then at best instrumentalism about the metaphysics, although modulo the things that Annika was saying. If Annika's right, and the second and third things are like there's something weird about like finding value for metaphysics if you're sort of like not even a realist about science, then there is like maybe you can't even be instrumentalist about metaphysics either. But I do think that like sorting, you know, finding metaphysical assumptions of a theory does not rely on there being a way to the truth about those assumptions, right? So I think the third option still persists. I think that showing how something could be true does not rely on there being a way to find out how something is actually true. So I think that those sense of value is still there, even if you sort of you can't be a realist or instrumentalist about science. That's sort of what I want to say there. But like, if this does just turn us all into instrumentalists about science, and Van Frosten was right, that's fine, because I kind of think he probably was anyway.
Thanks.
All right, David and Daniele.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask about the strength of the claim that metaphysics has no non-instrumental value. So, because I feel like there's weaker versions and stronger versions. So there's a sort of weak interpretation that I think everyone would agree to, that in metaphysics we can never know for certainty the right answer to these kinds of questions, but I think pretty much all metaphysicians would agree with that. There's a very strong reading that we can't have any justification at all for metaphysical truths.
Yeah.
So zero justification. And then there's a more moderate thing that perhaps we can have some, but little justification and less justification than we get in science. That's sort of moderate reading.
Yeah.
And I feel like the strong reading that we can have zero justification whatsoever for anything metaphysical, that seems pretty strong. And so one way to bring that out is it seems like there are certain metaphysical views that are just sort of presupposed by scientific things, and if we have no justification for that, then we have no justification for science. So take the question, is there an external world at all, or is kind of solipsism true that all that exists is me and my perceptions or something?
Yeah.
So people give inference the best explanation, arguments for an external world, like positing external world is the best explanation for the regularity of my experiences or something. But if we have zero justification at all for the external world, then we also have zero justification for general relativity and quantum mechanics and for any science, because all of that presupposes there's an external world. So if we have zero justification for certain metaphysical things, then I think we're going to have zero justification for the scientific things that presuppose those. And also, I think just when you look at specific examples of naturalistic metaphysics, I feel like it's hard to say that those give us zero justification for the relevant metaphysical things. So take a standard example of some people think the science of relativity undermines presentism, or kind of a theory of time. And that's certainly not a knockdown argument. A lot of presentists have a lot of moves of looking at different scientific views that are compatible with presentism. But I think most people would think at least that gives us some non-zero justification for rejecting presentism, and that the transition from Newton to Einstein, gave us some reason to reject this. So anyway, so just clarifying the strength of the claim, and is it the strong claim, and is the strong claim, is it implausible for the reasons I said, or why not?
Yeah. So I think I am more inclined towards the strong claim, so I'm going to stick my neck out. I am skeptical of this idea that science has metaphysical presuppositions in exactly the way that you're talking about, because I think that, let's suppose that we're a Boltzmann brain, right? You can do science. You can do science in exactly the way that we're doing science, on the sort of like phenomena that live inside the Boltzmann brain. You can come up with dynamical equations about how the things relate to each other. I just don't think doing general relativity presupposes that there's an external world. I think that that's like something we would like to think. I think that that's a sort of like scientific realist assumption that we carry into it. But like what general relativity presupposes is that there are phenomena that we can observe that we can then regiment and produce a theory of. But that's compatible with there being, like with it all being, image in God's mind or whatever, right? Like I think that, the discussions of idealism sort of early on made this point, that empirical science is sort of like preserved, even if idealism is true. Kant makes this point, right? Like there's no reason to think that because his transcendental idealism is true, that then empirical science has to be thrown out the window, because empirical science is then just on the world of phenomena, not on the world of noumena, right? So I think it's not obvious to me that those sorts of assumptions are baked into science. I also think that the metaphysical underdetermination of the world, like biophysical theories, might be evidence that scientific theories have a lot less metaphysics baked into them than we think. Because I think that underdetermination is quite severe in some cases where, like, it's not so obvious that you really need to have any metaphysics coming out of a scientific theory, precisely because even an external world not existing is compatible with it, right? So that's what I want to say. But like the second case worries me more, because I do think that lots of people think that there is justification, say, against presentism by virtue of the arguments from special relativity. I think, though, if you really look at those arguments carefully, you'll find that there is none.
But if you're really, I had a sort of ontological version of that question, but But if you really think you're a Boltzmann brain, there actually is no empirical science, right? All those papers that you're reading and that seem to be the science, they're just fluctuations as well.
But so yeah, now we're talking about what empirical means, right? Like empirical I don't see why empirical science can't just mean all of the things inside the Boltzmann brain, right? Why can't that just all be what empirical science is?
But if it's you, that's just your experiences of
Sure.
seeing those papers and talking.
Sure.
So that's not the activity of science anymore.
Isn't
right?
it? Isn't it? I mean, like, I think we're like asking like nasty questions about what science is at this point, and I just don't know that we have answers to those questions.
Okay, so but all the scientists are not there.
Oh yeah, but scientists are going to disagree with all kinds of things. Doesn't mean they're
But
right.
they don't exist.
I mean, that sucks for them. Look, I'll grant that. Like,
Okay.
Scientists are like, oh yeah, like we're doing this activity.
All right,
Yeah.
fair, okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, I get it's a consistent
Okay.
position, but
Yeah.
it's quite radical on what now science might end up meaning in this view.
I think it might end up meaning something different metaphysically, right? But that's precisely the sort of question I just don't think we can settle anyway. And like, I don't think we can settle it. Certainly, we can't settle it by sort of like looking at the consensus among scientists.
I mean, a lot of the questions, I guess, have been about the instrument, when being pushed to instrumentalism and
Yeah.
science, and I'm just
we
pointing
can.
out if it's really solipsism what that actually gets you to.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think it might soon be put to the test. I mean, your view, which I don't think is quite correct, because that's what people are discussing, in large language models.
Yeah.
How far can we get, like, by archiving, all knowledge about physics that has ever been written in the archive and maybe pre-archive.
Mm.
So the test would be, without referring to the external world, that's not something these models can do, of course, right now. Can they produce new, what I would call science, prediction, which then are seen to be fitting to the external world?
Yeah, I mean, I guess but like fitting to the external world is just totally compatible with the external world being an illusion.
Well, okay.
Right?
Well,
I mean, it's a metaphysical assumption to go beyond that and say, no, it's not just an illusion, it tracks reality, blah, 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 blah. But those are the sorts of things I just don't think we can settle because we don't have a method for settling them. Well. Yeah, fair enough.
I'm sorry, but we have a lot of questions. I'm trying to give the opportunity to as many people as possible to speak. So, so Daniele, then Richard, then Emilia.
Yeah, so I think that the number of points that I'm about to raise were already raised earlier, but let me phrase them in my own way so I understand what I'm talking about and what the answer is. What are the goals of science? Because
oh God, I was hoping, of all the questions I've ever not wanted to answer, that's... Yeah.
The moment you say that the metaphysics is instrumental only to science or to other endeavors because it helps indirectly fulfilling their goals, even if it doesn't or cannot reach its own stated goal of getting to the truth. I mean, how can you say that without specifying what the goals of science are? And I ask that because if you ask me what are the goals of science, maybe naively, I would have stated the one that you attributed to metaphysics.
Which one?
Yeah, reaching the truth.
Oh, right,
I
sure.
will now add a couple of comments there before you answer that. Just to clarify what I mean by reaching the truth. But if this is the goal of science, then the fact that metaphysics helps somehow science reaching that goal, which is in fact the same as the one on metaphysics, or very close to the one on metaphysics, goes exactly in the direction of, look, there's no such a big distinction between the two. There are different tools, different strategies, but they're aiming roughly to the same goal. So that's one point. Related to this, even maintaining the distinction between metaphysics and science in methodology, in goals, whatever, I don't believe it, but let's keep it. It seems to me that all of your arguments or objections against metaphysics being able to reach those goals apply to science in exactly the same form. I mean, underdetermination. I mean, now it's not underdetermination of metaphysics by science or by scientific theories, it's underdetermination of scientific theories by empirical data, and which is maybe equally severe, in fact. The unconceived alternatives. The fact that, yes, we have the best theory, the best model for a set of phenomena, and for us that's sufficient, but indeed, it's not that we have ever even tried to prove that there cannot be an alternative theory that explains better the data. We just haven't found it. We don't know what that could be. We didn't come up with a good suggestion or something else that worked, which is the same as it seems to be happening in metaphysics when it's successful partially. The fact that there's no algorithm for reaching to the conclusion. Well, I thought we were past the time in which we believe that science has an algorithm for confirming a theory or for constructing a theory. It doesn't work like that. It's not that scientists were taught rules when we are undergrads, and then we just apply those rules when we have to construct a new theory, and it's much more complex than that. And it seems to me, and then I stop, the point, it seems to me, not so much about all these various objections, it seems to lie in a notional truth, which is definitely too strong and entirely unnecessary. So, in my naive scientist view, the best explanation is the definition of truth. Of course, it's a partial, fallible, to be revised, to some extent subjective or culturally dependent notion of truth, but that's what in practice matters, and the only one we have. So it seems to me that the moment you remove that too strong notional truth as the goal, and you go for a more weak, modest notion of truth, then you can hold the form of realism, which is also, you can also hold the form of instrumentalism with the same notion of truth, because to some extent what you recognize as the best explanation as among the criteria may be also the fact that it allows you to reach other goals or fulfill other valuable ambitions. So
Annika was raising these worries about how this will generalize into science. The arguments I gave will motivate instrumentalism about science.
I'm saying that
so be it. I guess so be it. If that's the way this goes, fine. But I do think that there is this sort of sticking point where the distinction between realism and instrumentalism is a metaphysical distinction already, and then if we shouldn't think that we can settle that question for the same reasons that I've given, namely that we don't have a method for actually settling that. But I take the point. These look like arguments that will work in science as well, and that's no accident. The people that were attacking non-naturalistic metaphysics are drawing from those philosophy of science to do that. But then they want to be realist about naturalistic metaphysics, and all I'm saying is you've just got pressure to lose the realism about naturalistic metaphysics as well. In terms of what the goals of science are, I think that I think naturalistic metaphysics can be valuable regardless of what you think the goals of science are, although I didn't make that case here. So if you think that the goal of science is to get the truth, where that is 100% certainty or something like that, then I think naturalistic metaphysics can be useful for that. I think if you think that science aims at approximating the truth, I think naturalistic metaphysics can be useful for that. If you think that science is just not aiming at the truth at all, but just trying to regiment empirical data with math, then I think that naturalistic metaphysics can be helpful for that as well. Because I think that sometimes, although what you might want to be doing is regimenting empirical data with math, you inevitably sort of bring metaphysical stuff to the table, and sometimes stripping away that metaphysical stuff by virtue of seeing how the metaphysics might vary with respect to the sort of empirical regimentation of the mathematical regimentation of the empirical stuff that you've got, can also be quite useful. So I haven't made that case, but I do think it doesn't so much hang on what the goals of science are, except insofar as it connects with this instrumentalism, realism stuff. But then I think you've got a separate issue. Thanks.
Yeah, my question is about the role of the philosopher's role in light of what you're saying. And the starting point would once again be Annika's observation, which I think I share, that the role of what holds up best among the instrumental values of metaphysics on your view would be the toolbox role. And so it seems that if that's right, you take away from the philosopher the canonical role of kind of moving in after theories have been developed and on some philosophical level try to discuss what that's all about. And rather you give back the task of doing metaphysics to the scientists themselves in the role, in the process of developing their theories and using metaphysics as a toolbox, which one might interpret as saying, well, actually metaphysics is the scientist's task, not the philosopher's. And it's a misunderstanding on the side of philosophers to think that they should be the ones who do metaphysics. Now, one way to avoid that conclusion might be to say that the way the philosophers do metaphysics has some advantages with respect to serving as a toolbox with respect to metaphysics serving as a toolbox. So they are better in developing metaphysics that then can be used as a toolbox by the scientist. But if you want to give that that response, the question would be why? What about being philosophical about metaphysics is helpful for using metaphysics as a toolbox? So that would be my question.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a problem if it turns out scientists are doing metaphysics. I don't think it's a problem if it turns out that people who are doing metaphysics are doing science, precisely because I do think there is a continuity between these disciplines.
No, it's less about scientists doing metaphysics, but about philosophers are not. It's not helpful for philosophers to do metaphysics, on your view.
I will say that I don't think that follows. So I think that it is helpful for philosophers to do it, for a couple of reasons. One reason is that we've got a historical tradition of metaphysics that we're trained in, and we just know all of that stuff, and most scientists don't. I mean, some scientists do, but for the most part, scientists just don't know all of that. And so we are in a position to build, I think, metaphysical pictures based on our sort of historical attempts to do this that are just not accessible to the scientists. I don't want to make any strong claims to the effect that only philosophers should be doing metaphysics. I just don't see any reason to do that. But I think that the discipline itself is historically distinct to science, and that history is important to what it is that we can offer. I also think that we're trained in slightly different ways of thinking. Like, we're more trained in the kinds of methods that I'm pointing to, I think, than a lot of scientists are. And I think that's why sort of like trying to use these methods, even if they don't actually get at the truth, we might end up doing something that is a bit useful. But also there's something to be said for just division of labor. Scientists are busy doing other things. Maybe they just don't have the time to do the sorts of things that we can do. And so maybe there is no special thing that we need to be doing, but it's just someone needs to do that work. So philosophers have been doing it traditionally. We've got the sort of time to do that. So I guess I just want to resist the idea that there needs to be anything special that philosophers do in order to justify us doing the thing that we're doing.
So, Sam, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. So, I was wondering whether you could expand a bit on this. So, for me, it looks as if both GR and quantum mechanics are examples in which I cannot exactly see where to draw a distinction, net distinction between the theory and possible metaphysical assumptions. So, I was wondering that even if we assume that indeed you can try to do the net separation and to do different couplings between what the theory says and possible metaphysical assumptions, why do you need a comparative theory to run the indispensability argument in the first place? Why can't be the role of metaphysics just trying to see which of these couplings should be favored? And in case you would reject this, where would you then draw the line, the distinction between what we call naturalistic metaphysics and non-naturalistic metaphysics? Where would you see the distinction. If you want to assume this kind of a freedom of the naturalistic couplings with respect to the theory.
So with the first point, I think that even just trying to work out which coupling between a scientific theory and a metaphysical theory is favourable is going to require some method. And the methods we have available seem to be things like theoretical virtues or inference to best explanation. So it's not obvious to me that that's getting us away from using those methods. You know, there is this question about like how separate are the scientific and the metaphysical theories. I guess that, like, you know, this may be a little bit facetious, but when we teach people general relativity, we don't teach them about ontic structural realism, right? Like, there are ways of understanding those theories that just seem to be completely divorced from what we do in metaphysics. And that's at least some indication to me that there is a way of understanding what those theories are on about that doesn't require or presuppose any particular metaphysics. But, like, as I said, that's a bit facetious, because probably no argument for pedagogy is a good argument. But, like, there's something there, I think. The second point, right? Just remind me of the second point, Amelia.
Yeah, so in case the point is that the indispensability argument is not new in the context of naturalistic metaphysics.
Yeah.
Then where do you draw the line between these two types of?
Good. I don't know where to draw the line, and actually there's another argument that I didn't run that I'm quite tempted by, and that argument goes like this. Try and draw the line between naturalistic and non-naturalistic metaphysics. There is no way to draw that line well. So if you're instrumentalist about non-naturalistic metaphysics, you're instrumentalist about metaphysics too cool. And I think that argument is quite plausible, because if you look at the definitions of naturalistic metaphysics that people give, they're not good. They are things like pay attention to science, be connected to science, like those, like all from the very weak up to the very strong. Metaphysics is about taking theories that are empirically equivalent and trying to work out what the metaphysics of those theories is, right? Like, you've got all from the very weak, all to the very strong, and none of them look particularly plausible as a demarcation between naturalistic and non-naturalistic metaphysics. And also, I don't think that non-naturalistic metaphysics, I don't know that there is any metaphysics that is completely divorced from science. Because all of the sort of input materials to metaphysics, even of the most egregious, like a priori kind, are like assuming some things about the world that I think we've pulled from science. So I'm just very skeptical that there is a distinction to run here. But if there is no distinction, I think the argument is even easier to make in some sense.
Right, last question from Enrico, and I'm sorry, Tim, Niels, but you will have priority for the next Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. This was nice. Well, I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just settle for asking something that I think no one has talked about yet, which is just like Lorenzo started by pushing back on the indispensability thing. I want to push back a bit on the principle of not.
Oh, thank you.
I knew you had a bonus level. Sure. I was actually trying to get it. Because, so the principle of naturalistic closure, you're right that they formulated, right, as a claim on what kind of hypothesis I'm supposed to take seriously. But if I remember correctly, my Ladyman and Ross, which has been a while, they do couple. I can't remember if it's actually supposed to be part of the principle of naturalistic closure or just part of their picture with a criterion for choosing a theory. And even if, and like, their criterion, I think, if I remember correctly, is something like that these hypotheses that you make and that you take seriously are also supposed to be discriminated by empirical evidence. So they have the same type of evidential basis that you use for scientific theories. Even if you don't accept that by claiming that, well, how many metaphysical hypotheses actually do that? I feel like you can just take the principle of naturalistic closure and just, it seems very natural to just add to it as a discriminating principle, something like that you should always prefer any metaphysical hypothesis which unifies a larger and larger set of scientific hypotheses because it just accounts for more evidence. And again, that seems a very sort of straightforward way in which the evidence supports your hypothesis because it gives you sort of, not really, it just gives you it as just a larger evidential basis behind it. Sort of like how we prefer general relativity to Newtonian mechanics because we have a bunch of things that general relativity explains and Newtonian mechanics doesn't. And like if you take the example, for example, of the geometric and functionalist approach to GR, you might, for example, try to run that to, for example, advantage for stuff like functionalism in that case. You can be like, okay, the geometric approach is sort of very focused. Like it doesn't give me a lot of unification because I'm really focused on just claiming that there is this geometric background to whatever the space-time theory that I enjoy is. The functionalist approach allows me to actually account for all sorts of different space-time backgrounds that appear in all sorts of different theories, which I venture to guess is going to be very difficult to do with the geometric approach. So it's like, okay, well, you have a slide, so I'll just stop here.
Yeah, thank you for finding bonus slide 3, naturalistic closure again. I don't know if this is exactly the principle that you just gave me, but you're right. It's not hard to come up with ways of turning what Ladyman and Ross say into something that is a criterion for theory choice. So what I did is I just said, well, look, take any metaphysical claim, and it's true only if it provides a way to unify two distinct scientific claims that, when unified, jointly explain more than what is explained by the two claims taken separately. So that's sort of at least in the neighborhood of what you said. And just my worry here is like, we're still going to have to run some kind of preference algorithm over this, right? We're going to have to like compare different metaphysical assumptions that unify in different ways and say, okay, this unification is preferable to that unification because we explain more. Why? Well, explanation of this type is a virtue, and then we're back in, really this is a version of inference to the best explanation at this point, right? And my worry here is that, you know, IBE is broken, but even if it's not broken insofar as you can justify it in science, this looks like it's not obvious to me, at least, that the kind of cases that scientists might be using IBE to successfully on are of this type, where what we're doing is we're sort of, okay, we've got all the empirical data satisfied, we've got the math satisfied, but now what we're doing is we're adding some metaphysical assumptions to unify and explain things that sort of are like going beyond what we've already done scientifically. And I just worry that the use of IBE, insofar as it can be justified, at least faces a question of how you generalize it to these sorts of activities, because it's not obvious to me that they are the same activities that scientists are doing.
Well, just if I have like 1 second to, the way that I would actually reboot the PNC is not exactly that. I think it might make a difference. So instead of saying that you have a claim, like a metaphysical claim, T is true only if the claim provides the means to unify two distinct scientific claims, I would reboot it by saying it gives you the tools to unify n scientific claims, and then explain more is understood in terms of larger and larger n in that claim. And
I worry about that.
That's just larger evidential basis.
But like go back to the literature on explanation, and you'll see that like explaining more on its own can't ever be enough, right? So like Kitcher's unificationist theory, which is like the best version of this going, he puts a trade-off between more and like in some notion of like you know, depth or stringency on the explanations, precisely because you can come up with explanations that unify everything very easily, right? God says it so. Plug that into your scientific theory and it explains everything, right? And that just seems like a really bad explanation, a bad thing, even though it's got maximum unifying power. So it needs to be sort of unifying power tempered with something else. Problem is we have no idea what that other thing is that tempers unifying power in order to get us explanations of the right type. And this is where Kitcher comes unstuck, right? Because there is no good account of that thing, and his account certainly isn't that one, and you know that sort of played out in the literature. So there are still problems, I think.
Right, thank you everybody. Let's reconvene in 10 minutes at 10:50.
Thanks for your comments and questions, everybody, and thanks, Annika.